Russia steps up its military presence in Crimea, accusing Ukraine of attempting an armed incursion into the region it annexed 2 years ago. Ukraine says that's a fantasy. So, is there a risk of the conflict escalating, and how will the West react? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. Russian President Vladimir Putin has accused Ukraine of carrying out a border raid in Crimea. He says that attack killed 2 Russian officers, an allegation the Ukrainian government has denied. Now, as you may remember, Russia annexed Crimea 2 years ago and it now controls the territory. It has recently increased its troop numbers along Crimea's border with Ukraine. Kiev says it will respond in kind. So could the worst escalation of tensions in months reignite the wider conflict between the 2 neighbors? We'll be asking our guests that in just a moment. But first, Al Jazeera's Nataliya Gumenyuk reports.
It may be a conflict forgotten by many outside Ukraine, but people here continue to live with the threat of more bloodshed and the realization that friends could now become enemies.
Nobody
could imagine the person you used to drink with, you are now pointing a gun at and shooting at. The situation is bad, and until recently it was quiet, but it's starting up again. That's why they are closing other checkpoints.
In recent days, there have been accusations and rhetoric between the Ukrainian and Russian governments, and that has heightened concern that more fighting could be on the way. Russian President Vladimir Putin is accusing Ukraine of attempting to launch a terrorist attack in Crimea in the last week. He says 2 Russian officers were killed as a result, and now the Ukrainians must face the consequences.
The current authorities in Kiev are not looking for a way to solve problems through talks, but are turning to terror. This is a very alarming thing.
The Ukrainian government calls the accusation ridiculous, but it has put its troops stationed near Crimea on what it calls the highest level of combat readiness.
We still hope that it will not, bring the conflict to another level, but it seems that it is quite possible, unfortunately.
Ukraine has been fighting to keep its borders from shrinking since 2014. That's when a pro-Russian president resigned after weeks of protests. Russia then sent troops to the Crimea Peninsula, and a referendum was pushed through. Now Russia controls Crimea. An analyst tells Al Jazeera Russia's accusations come as it prepares to conduct military maneuvers in the Black Sea, and with parliamentary elections expected in Crimea next month.
And it is possible and arguable that the Russians are using this threat, these allegations of threats by the Ukraine, to bolster their support amongst the local population, to pro-Russian unification parties do better in those elections.
President Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart are expected to meet with mediators at the G20 summit next month. Many are waiting to see if that's enough to stop a possible return to conflict in the region. Nataliya Gumenyuk for Inside Story.
Well, time now to bring in our guests in Kiev. Nataliya Gumenyuk, head of the Ukrainian news channel Hromadske TV. In Moscow, Sergey Strokan, political commentator at the daily newspaper Kommersant. And in London, Domitilla Sagramoso, lecturer in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Nataliya Gumenyuk in Kiev, if I may start with you. In the last few hours, the President Petro Poroshenko, the President of Ukraine, has ordered all Ukrainian units near the Crimea and Donbass regions to be at their highest level of what he calls combat readiness. Is this just saber rattling, or are they indeed preparing themselves for something big?
So we are also closely following, and it's true that the administrative border with Crimea is heavily fortified already for a couple of years, and it's pretty unexpected accusation of the Russian president. As we know already so far, when we fact-check, that there is very little evidence of the real case. We don't know if there were the Russian military ever killed. We know a lot of evidence provided by the Russian security forces are, couldn't be proven. So it could be some photo of the tent, of the touristic tent you can find online. So we really didn't know that. We know that there was a Ukrainian citizen captured there whose identity we could confirm. But from the political point of view, Kiev, the Ukrainian government, was really never interested in any military operation in Crimea for more than the last 2 years. There is a difference with the story with Donbass, with Eastern Ukraine. There is a fighting there. It's had escalated within the last 2 months. But for the last 2 years, there was never really this discussion of the possible fight there. And even we talked to many military experts from Russia, Ukraine, from the region. These kind of things like the shooting on this small territory is really go against the military logic.
Okay,
so
let's pick up on one of the points. You've made a lot of points, Nataliya. Let me just pick up on one of the points that you've made. And that is the Russian government claimed that there was an alleged terrorist attack in Crimea over the weekend. Let's bring in Sergey Strokan in Moscow. Sergey, has there actually been an attack, as Moscow says, or are they using it to justify an attack, as some analysts have predicted?
Well, as you understand, it is extremely difficult not to take sides in just assessing what's going on these days in Crimea, because, as you know, you're well aware that we are involved in the information war with Ukraine, and obviously both sides would try to interpret the incident its own way. However, let me say that
was there an incident? Was there actually an incident?
So it depends on how you see it. Russia sees it as an act of terror because 2 Russian officers were killed. They were killed by intruders. While international law doesn't give any definition of terrorism, Russian authorities believe that they have every right to call it an act of terror. However, let me just give you an explanation of how we see this particular events in Crimea. What is most striking that unlike the events in Donbass, which has claimed lives of thousands of people, as you are aware, the takeover of Crimea 2 years ago took place in a bloodless operation. Again, you may call it the takeover or reunification, as Moscow describes it, but not a single drop of blood was spilled. Probably this is only now when we've seen the first victims in Crimea, and this is very sad and tragic, because this brings our already strained relations to more chill, and they can be hardly any way out of that quite soon.
Before I bring in Domitilla, let me just ask you one more question, Sergey. When President Putin, the Russian leader, says that he will not let the death of these 2 Russian soldiers pass, what does he mean exactly? What sort of action can we expect from Russia?
Obviously, that was a carefully worded warning to Ukrainian side that Russia would not tolerate that, and it will work out some measures which has still to be decided. Let me just give you a parallel, an example, that when a Russian plane was shot down by a Turkish side last November, as you know, Russia retaliated with a complex of measures, including economic sanctions, and we freezed political contacts. So in practical terms, it can lead to further, suspending the relations, which are already, as I said, at the law, because we don't have even our ambassador in Ukraine at the moment.
Okay.
I won't say that we will break up the relations, but we can expect another stalemate, you see, and no one says how long will it last.
Okay, let me bring in Domitilla now. Let me just bring in Domitilla in London before you can add another point. Domitilla in London, Sergey talks about what we can expect. What are your thoughts about the current situation? Obviously, the war in Ukraine has never really ended in the last 2 years. We've seen a regular flare-ups of violence in the east between Ukrainian government troops and pro-Russia separatists. Do you sense it's different this time around, that we could see indeed a new conflict?
Well, I tend to agree with the previous speakers that I don't think either side is interested really in a military escalation of the situation in Crimea. It doesn't really benefit either of the sides. I think that there is a very strong effort to, especially I think on the side of Moscow, to kind of calm the situation in the east and reach some kind of settlement, which for obvious reasons Ukrainians are not very happy with, and we can discuss this at length. I think what should be kept in mind was the fact that there was a sort of a reinforcement of troops and of military equipment in Crimea before this incident, and I think that has to be considered within the context of the relations between Russia and NATO and the decision in Warsaw at the NATO summit in July to reinforce a NATO military presence in the Baltic states and Poland with its 4 battalions. So I think that Russia has responded, at least at late July, with a reinforcement of a military presence in Crimea and in the North Caucasus. And this indicates sort of the high level of tension that is taking place between the two sides, and the sort of call that President Putin made a couple of weeks ago or more to really raise attention in the West and in NATO countries that the situation with Russia is extremely tense, and that these sort of incidents that can spark, really an escalation of violence. So my take on this is that probably a lot of effort is going to be made to reduce the tension and to prevent any kind of large-scale violence. Okay. I think Ukrainians have no interest and no plan really to retake control over this region by force, and has been said by the first speaker, there was never any real plan. However, it really remains unclear. There are so many conflicting reports as to what exactly happened, right, whether there was really an attack or whether there was a sort of information that there were the saboteurs, and then there was an attempt to take hold of them, and as a result there was a fire shoot. So it's really unclear what exactly happened, the amount of people involved, and where they come from exactly.
Let's bring in Nataliya once again in Kiev. Nataliya, Domitilla says that both sides are...
Of course, I should...
Let me just ask you this.
I should just really confirm that from our correspondents, from talking to the people in Crimea and the correspondents who are currently on this separation line, you can't say about the big escalation, but you know that you have the visual evidence of more military presence, vehicles in the Crimean Peninsula. Though I think we can get out of the debate if there was the alleged attack or not, because we talked to the family of the guy who had been accused by the security service, and as well, neither there was any other witness, because we should also explain that Ukrainian citizens can travel to Crimea exactly where the situation was described. There were people could go and they regularly travel. So it's really, we see this event as a very political, what it's seen from here, as a really political event, and just trying to understand who would benefit from that. It was very interesting also to hear that Vladimir Putin said that he finds useless the meeting of the Normandy 4. This is France, Germany, Russia and Ukraine format where they discuss the peace resolution.
The Minsk agreement. Sorry, you've made a lot of interesting points, and I do want to bring in the other guests now. Sergey and Nataliya referred to the Minsk agreement, the agreement over the war in Ukraine itself. Where does this recent escalation leave that Minsk agreement as far as Russia is concerned?
Well, as you are aware, Minsk agreement was worked out to find comprehensive solution for Donbass conflict. Donbass conflict is something different from Crimea. That's a conflict which claimed, as I said, the lives of thousands of people, and this particular conflict dragged Russia into a full-fledged sanction war with the West. There are also sanctions which were imposed on Russia on Crimea, but compared to the sanctions which were imposed over Donbass, Crimea sanctions package is quite symbolic. Technically speaking, you may say that Crimea is totally different story, and it has nothing to do with the situation in Donbass and Minsk agreement. However, as you understand, they are overlapping stories because they show the degree of crisis which we have in our relations with Ukraine and the West. And Minsk agreements are in deep trouble for a reason that the process of translating them into reality has came to a deadlock. The last meeting of so-called Normandy 4, that's a group of four countries, Russia, Ukraine, Germany and France. So the last meeting in the format of foreign ministers meeting took place mid-May. After that, we were expecting for the leaders of Normandy 4 to meet at the upcoming G20 summit in China, but yesterday President Putin ruled out such meetings, saying that it would be inappropriate and irrelevant to sit together and to set a new set of negotiations within the frame of Normandy 4.
Okay.
You may ask why he has responded towards Normandy 4, which has nothing to do with Crimea. So the belief here in Moscow is that by making such a statement, President Putin is sending clear signal to the West that he expects very strong relation from European leaders on the events in Crimea, because when they denounce the acts of terrorism in Europe, they have to show equal resolve when it comes to Crimea.
Domitilla, in Moscow, what are your thoughts on what you just heard there, especially on the last, in London, especially on the last point there that, you know, Russia is expecting Europe, I mean the West anyway, to perhaps get a bit more involved and say something about the current escalations in tensions in Ukraine. Do you think that is likely to happen?
I think it is unlikely, because I think it is very unclear yet what actually happened, and it's going to be very hard to get very sort of impartial information about exactly what occurred. There's no filming of a particular event. Usually when we talk about terror attacks in European countries, there's a lot of sort of information coming up, even by individuals there. So that is going to be very difficult. But if I may add, I mean, I think the problem with the Minsk agreement, you know, is not really related to events in Crimea.
In Crimea, it is not, right?
You know, it is not, because I think that there the problem is really about, as was said previously, about how to implement, you know, the requests for elections to be held in these regions, and then to move ahead with some kind of special status, and as a result of that, you know, a better control or a full control by Ukraine of the border with Russia. And the Ukrainians have been very clear that they really are not going to move ahead before there is control over the border, before there is a demilitarization of the zone. They have even requested OSCE sort of police officials to patrol the border with Russia. And only when they are able to access properly, and their political parties access properly these two regions, and only after they're able with their media to participate actively and transparently in these elections, are they going to be ready to hold them. Okay. Now, there's been a lot of pressure on them from both the United States and the European countries and Russia to move ahead, because it's in the interest now of both the United States and Western countries to try to reduce the tension in the relations with Russia. And there is some request among some countries, especially, for example, Italy, France, that are kind of receiving a lot of pressure to put an end to these sanctions. Okay. And I think that this also cannot be seen as in isolation, for example, from the relation between the United States and Russia as far as the Syrian conflict is concerned,
because we're likely to see the US and Russia negotiating more on Syria. Let me bring in Nataliya in Kiev once again. Nataliya, Petro Poroshenko just a few hours ago again said that he was going to initiate phone conversations with the leaders of Germany, France, the US Vice President Joe Biden, who was recently in the region. I wonder, what exactly are Ukrainian government officials, is the Ukrainian government hoping to get from Europe and the West as far as the recent tensions are concerned? What do they want to hear?
So what we understand that therefore there is a conflict, there is sometimes very little international attention. Doesn't matter that the fighting sometimes takes place. So it's very difficult to keep this pressure on Russia, especially on the sanctions, and even the Western community sometimes sound to be exhausted. So of course these kind of escalation are explained as a proof that you can't just forget and pretend and go to the business as usual. So, of course, at this point, the Ukrainian president and the government waits from the, from the partners or from the allies somehow the strong position. It's not much you can expect, but the clear statement, either from Berlin, which really leads the discussion, and as well France and the US, probably would mean something, and probably that would be the way again to have maybe another round of talk in the format of the Normandy meeting, because we know that the Minsk agreement, this process, it's kind of stalled, because a lot of people would say there is very little information, but to be honest, when you talk to the correspondents, our correspondents really travel to the ground. We know that for the last half a year in the separatist-controlled territories controlled with the Russia, there is kind of stronger security measures. It doesn't mean that there should be escalation, but we know there are more military. We know there is more difficult to talk. There are almost no foreign correspondents allowed to work there. So there is kind of tension and understanding what would happen next, because we can't tell that the Minsk process goes well, because today the election, according to the international OSCE standards, looks like impossible, because you can't even get a couple of TV reporters to be there, not just about international organization to monitor this election. So it's definitely the time to really think about that. But it's true that probably in this condition, before this accusation and this, it's not the first time when Vladimir Putin says something. It's sometimes later we find out it hadn't been confirmed, but still you have to watch out. But still, for the Ukrainian government, it was probably better just to have the things as they are and prolong this process before any kind of solution is there. As so far, the only solution is still keeping the sanction against the Russia.
Okay. Sergey, in Moscow, Russia is also preparing for parliamentary elections on September the 18th. How does that play into the current situation and these war of words that we're seeing between Moscow and Kiev right now? Are domestic politics also at play here?
You are right. Russia is facing parliamentary elections, and those events in Ukraine, we've seen that those events in Ukraine only 4 weeks before parliamentary elections here in Russia. Obviously, the Crimea issue was a hot-button issue for Russian politics for the last 2 years. And the attitude to Russia's moves in Crimea even served as a criteria or a litmus test for a newly found Russian patriotism. That's why what's going on Ukraine is extremely sensitive for Russian politics. And if we witness the acts of terror, then that can even be seen as even more serious issue, which should be addressed in the more resolute way. In practical terms, I think that those candidates who are involved now in the race for parliament seats would be involved in patriotic rhetoric, saying that we should show resolve to those intruders. We should not allow the acts of terror, and we should show our loyalty to the authorities, which are undertaking all measures to enhance Russia's national security and not to allow such things to happen. So obviously we will see, just to wrap it up, we will see we're playing the card of Russian nationalism, attributing to Russia's legal, legitimate rights on Crimea.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you very much for an interesting discussion. Nataliya Gumenyuk, Sergey Strokan and Domitilla Sagramoso. Thank you all for being on Inside Story. And thank you for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. You can also go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.